Good morning, and welcome to this second day of our conference on Jesus and the Pharisees. We have a very full program today, as we did yesterday, and so we will not spend a lot of time on introductions. But I would like to welcome, first of all, our first speaker, Professor Harry Attridge, the Sterling Professor of Divinity at Yale University. He was Dean of the Yale Divinity School from 2002 to 2012. He made scholarly contributions to New Testament exegesis, the study of Hellenistic Judaism, and history of the early church. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. He's been active in the Society of Biblical Literature, served as president of the Society in 2001, and in the Catholic Biblical Association, of which he was president 2011-2012. We had the privilege last year of having Professor Attridge as a visiting professor at the Biblical Institute, teaching a course on Christology in John and Hebrews. And so without further ado, I would ask Professor Attridge to speak to us on the question of Jesus, Nicodemus, and the other Pharisees in the Gospel of John.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah. Am I on? Yeah, all right. Yes, you got to push the buttons, don't you? In any case, delighted to be with you, and thank you to all the organizers of this really interesting conference. So at this point, we're going to think a little bit about several things. We're going to look at the whole Gospel of John and where the Pharisees pop up in it. We're going to think a little bit about the Pharisees and another set of characters that are prominent in the fourth Gospel, the Ioudaioi, and I'm going to leave that term untranslated. We can debate whether it should be translated the Jews or the Judeans or whatever later. And I want to look at a very special case of a Pharisee that pops up in the Gospel of John, that is Nicodemus, and think a little bit about a character that may be positive, may be somewhat ambiguous. We'll see. In any case, for our overview, we can note that Pharisees appear in 18 verses of the Gospel of John. They start out in the first chapter after people are sent to question John the Baptist, and the first reference to those who are sent refers to them as the Ioudaioi, but then in chapter 1, verse 24, it's the Pharisees who have apparently sent these questioners to John, or have supplied the people to be sent. There's a little ambiguity there. We can come back to that. I'm going to skip one of the references because that's the Nicodemus appearance in 3:1. They next appear in chapter 4, verse 1, and by now they're clearly in opposition to Jesus. And that's pretty much their function throughout most of the text, to be opponents to Jesus. They pervade chapters 7 and 8, at least at the beginning of chapter 7, and we'll have to think a little bit about what happens in chapter 8 as the Ioudaioi come onto the scene. They appear once in chapter 8, verse 3, that little interpolation, the woman caught in adultery. That's the one time they appear with the scribes. We'll come back to that in a bit, too. They're there prominently in the healing of the man born blind in chapter 9. They're there at the end of the story about the resurrection of Lazarus, often with the high priests. I have in these little brackets the people that appeared with them, the chief priests, high priests, however you want to translate that. They're there at the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and they're there when he's arrested, often in consort with the chief or high priests. So that's the general overview of where Pharisees appear, and as I say, they are pretty much the permanent opposition. Their characterization, I think, is based on synoptic traditions. We have Pharisees plotting against Jesus in Mark 3 and in Matthew 12. This is part of a larger question, that is the relationship of John to the synoptics, and I'm on the side of those who see John as aware of and creatively reusing synoptic traditions rather than being independent of the synoptics. So I think he's getting a lot of his connections from texts like these. Pharisees and the chief priests, interestingly enough, appear in Matthew 21. which, as we heard in one of our earlier presentations this week, is a Matthean addition to a tradition that we get in Mark. Now, this is one of those cases where I think John is picking up a detail that he reads in Matthew and then uses it as a major structural element for his characterization. Pharisees are associated with the teachers of the law or lawyers in Luke, and they're associated, interestingly enough, with the Herodians in Mark. That association doesn't appear in the Gospel of John, although the Pharisees are associated with the rulers. The rulers, however, in John are always in Judea and not Herodians connected with Galilee. Pharisees and scribes are all over the place in the synoptic Gospels, right? But only there in John 8:3, which is one little indication that that is probably an interpolation and something that was added to the text at some point. As interesting as the connections are, it's also interesting to note what's missing from the characterization of the Pharisees in the fourth gospel. There's no discussion of a fundamental principle of the Torah, loving God and loving neighbor, as we get in Matthew 22 or Luke 10. No discussion of the resurrection, as is prominent in the characterization of the Pharisees in Acts. You'd never know that the Pharisees had a particular interest in resurrection just reading the Gospel of John. No interest in dining with tax collectors and sinners. No interest in questions about fasting. No interest in exorcism. No interest in whether one should wash one's hands before dinner. None of these factors that are prominent in the controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Synoptics appear in the Johannine version. No discussion of divorce. And nothing about oaths, vows, tithings, gnats, or cups. The sorts of things that Adela Collins was talking about yesterday from Matthew 23. Just a lot of stuff that's not there. There's a focus in John in the characterization of the Pharisees, and a particular Pharisee, on something. And one of our questions, I think, should be, what is that focus? But the fact that there is that focus, I think, tells us something about what we have in the Gospel of John. That is, a dramatic characterization for rhetorical purposes, rather than a collection of interesting factoids about history. And one of the questions I think we need to sort out as we go through this seminar is whether our interests are mainly in the historical questions of what the Pharisees were, or in the kind of theological literary questions of how Pharisees were used to make rhetorical points. Polemic is missing as well. The Pharisees are not characterized as having some sort of yeasty qualities, as they are in Matthew 16 or Luke 12. They're not described as hypocrites, as they are in Matthew and in Luke. The Pharisees are, however, blind in chapter 9, and apparently deliberately so. And one of the things we should think about just a little bit is how that characterization might work as part of a larger theme. And I suppose they have to be included in some way or other in the characterization of the Ioudaioi as children of the devil, what we get in John 8:44. But they're not explicitly so characterized. They're not in the crosshairs in the way they are, let's say, in Matthew 23, in that polemical context. What do Pharisees do, thematically and theologically? We could spend a little time on this, and in the written version of this paper I'll say a little bit more about this, but just to throw a hint out about how they work. They tie into certain themes that are prominent in what I call the arabesque of the fourth gospel. Arabesque, not the dance move, but the intertwined vines of themes that run through the fourth gospel. And that intertwining of themes makes some important theological points. One of the points that is made in the fourth gospel has to do with the theme of witnessing or testimony. And a number of people have written on this, the trial motif in the gospel, etc. And in any case, Jesus is a witness, but of what sort? He doesn't bear witness to himself, he says in chapter 5, verse 31. Then in chapter 8, verse 13, he testifies to himself as the light of the world, and immediately the Pharisees pop in and say, now wait a minute, are you testifying to yourself? Bringing up the theme that's been articulated in chapter 5. And Jesus responds and says, well, I bear witness to what I know. So he is bearing witness to himself after a fashion, right? Contradicting himself in chapter 5. Is this a separate layer in the development of the text, or John playing games? I think it's the latter, but that's another story. I think it's the latter because this theme of testimony becomes a very prominent element in the last one of the last episodes, the appearance before Pilate, where Jesus formally declares, "It is for this that I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth." Okay? So this is a Johannine theme. It's something that John exploits and plays with in a number of ways, and the Pharisees played their bit role in the development of that theme. That, I think, is something of an indication of what this characterization does in the gospel. I think the characterization of the Pharisees as blind that we get in chapter 9, verse 40, also ties into a major theological theme that the gospel is developing, and that is the question of individual responsibility in the face of divine sovereignty. And how those two principles are held together in the fourth gospel has been a matter of considerable debate. Is the gospel a Calvinist text, or is it a Thomistic text? Or does it come somewhere down in between? And I think where it comes down is somewhat like where Stoics come down, saying that the divine force is largely in charge of everything, but there's this little realm of human freedom, and this realm of human freedom is our ability to assent or dissent to the proposition that's put in front of us by the one who bears witness to the truth. And the Pharisees play a role in the development of that little theme. So they do play roles in theology of the fourth gospel. Now, there are other elements of the fourth gospel that have been associated with the Pharisees, and we heard a little bit about them the other day. The stone jars and the pools, the mikvaot. The stone jars appear prominently in the Cana episode. This is a picture of Giotto, where the jars are prominently displayed in the lower right. And the picture on the right of the screen is from the Pool of Siloam in its relatively recent state. And both of these are indicative of what Professor Myers was talking about the other day, the widespread interest in ritual purity of various sorts that was prominent in Judea and in Galilee and in various other places in the first century and beyond. And sometimes this has been associated in a major way with the Pharisees. It's not so associated in John. And as Professor Myers pointed out, it's probably much more general than a simple Pharisaic kind of program, although the Pharisees probably supported it as well. This also points out something that we're going to have to wrestle with a little bit more. That is that John seems to be aware, John the evangelist, seems to be aware of certain conditions in the first century that are historical. And that fact has been taken by many people, some scholars and many other people, to say that, look, John is really interested in giving us history. I think John is interested in giving us a verisimilitudinous picture of the first century, but he's not interested in the historical questions per se. And this is an example of that. We're going to see another example in just a minute. Okay, so the Pharisees are part of a larger picture of opposition to Jesus in the fourth gospel, and this opposition is largely led by the Ioudaioi. And who are they? And what's their relationship to the Pharisees? The problem is presented to us already in that first chapter, because after the prologue, we are told that the Ioudaioi send people to question John the Baptist. That's in John 1:19. And then, a little bit later in verse 24, we're told that they were sent ek ton Pharisaion from the Pharisees. Is ek meaning by, or is it the group from which the people are sent? Commentators debate that. I think one way of reading the data is that what we have is a story that John has picked up, that Pharisees from Jerusalem sent people to question John the Baptist, and then this is later framed in a way that says it's the Ioudaioi, whoever they are, that are responsible, and then that older layer is corrected by changing the pronoun, or changing the preposition. We can debate that. But in any case, there's some sort of relationship between Ioudaioi and Pharisaioi, and Ioudaioi seem to be the larger category right there at the beginning. This relationship becomes prominent in chapters 7 and 8, where Jesus is in Jerusalem for the Feast of Sukkot, and is engaged in a dialogue with the people in Jerusalem about a variety of things. A large part of it is where the Messiah comes from and whether one should know where the Messiah comes from. And John is playing with that theme too. And the people who are prominent in the early stages of this dialogue in chapter 7 are the Pharisees. But in chapter 8, their role is taken over by the Ioudaioi. And that dialogue becomes increasingly tensive, as you know, until at the very end of chapter 8, the Ioudaioi pick up stones and get ready to stone Jesus because of all of the things that he's been saying to them, even though some of them believe in him. A curious kind of note. Okay, so one way of reading this text, or this collection of data, is to say that we have a clear example here of the different additions or strata in the fourth gospel. Where originally there were Pharisees who were the opponents of Jesus, and then they come to be labeled the Ioudaioi in edition number 2 or number 3. This, for instance, is the position of Camp von Balde in his commentary of, 7 or 8 years ago, which posits 3 additions to the fourth gospel. He's not the first person to articulate a theory of that sort, but does so in part, at least, on the basis of this set of data about the Pharisees and the Ioudaioi. I think it's a tad more complex. And what we get in John is probably an intricate play on the various meanings of Iudaios. The Ioudaioi instill fear already in 7:13, which would be a primitive layer of this whole thing. Some of them believe in Jesus in chapter 8, and they exhibit in much of this dialogue kind of regional connotation. They despise Galileans, like New Yorkers tend to despise people from West Virginia. They're obtuse urbanites. They seem to be sophisticated, but they don't get simple points, like Jesus talking about where he's going. And they say, what? Is he going to the Gentiles? Dramatic irony, of course. And they disparage Jesus as a Samaritan. So again, a regional sense is part of it. And this may be a primitive layer of the tradition that's developed in the fourth gospel. In any case, it's part of the final mix. And John is very happy to play on different meanings of Iudaios. I think that's important to keep in mind. And that makes it difficult, I think, to sort out different editions. Okay, so let's turn to the case of a special Pharisee, Nicodemus. And Jesus and Nicodemus appear in 3 places, as you probably know, in John 3, 1 through 10, where Nicodemus is identified as a Pharisee and as a leader, an archon of the Jews. And he winds up at the end of his conversation with Jesus asking, how in the world can this be? So a wise guy, all right, but not too terribly wise in the ways of the revelation that Jesus is bringing. He appears in John 7:51, at a meeting of the Sanhedrin, where, thank you very much, where some of the folk are saying that we need to bring this guy in, and he objects, Nicodemus objects, and says you can't do this because that's not what the law allows. You've got to let the guy have some opportunity to testify. And he immediately gets labeled as a Galilean, playing on this regional sensitivity that's an important part of the thematics of this Sukkot event. And then, famously in John 19, with a cross-reference to chapter 3, which shows again that there's a very deliberate development of a character here. Many people have worried about this in recent Johannine scholarship, how much deliberate characterization is going on, and are characters round as opposed to flat? Well, this is probably one case of a character who has some rotundity to him, and something on which the evangelist has spent some time. And as you know, at this point, Nicodemus brings 100 liters of myrrh and aloes for the burial of Jesus. And what the significance of that extravagant expenditure for the burial is something we're going to have to worry about. You've seen some of the artwork that illustrates some of these scenes already. The Queen Hendrik's Full Marine, early 17th century art, which I think is on display over here, or at least a picture of it is on display. Very Caravaggio-esque, the typical light and dark motifs of the early 17th century. We have light and darkness, a theme of the gospel, illustrated in an interesting way, in a very different way in this 19th century American realist painting by Henry Tanner, Jesus and Nicodemus by Night. The setting is important, the symbolism is important, all of this is part of the artistry of the fourth gospel. The characterization of Nicodemus presents us with several issues. Are there literary precedents for this? Are there historical connections? And what finally is the rhetorical project of the fourth gospel? In terms of literary precedents, I think what's lurking in the background are stories like that of the question of the rich young man that we get in Mark 10, Matthew 19, and Luke 18. Nicodemus is probably a rich guy, and we'll come back to that, and I think that's an important part of the characterization. Nicodemus, however, doesn't ask, as the rich young man does, about what he must do to attain the kingdom. Jesus gives him the response without even the question being posed. You have to be born again, anno then, with all of the complexity of what that means. And Jesus unpacks that in two ways, one having to do with water and spirit, and one having to do with recognition of the Son of Man. So, as usual, John is packing a lot in and wrapping it up in a interesting symbolic package. There's also, I think, an interesting sapiential reference in this dialogue between Jesus and Nicodemus that may say something about what the evangelist is trying to evoke with the character of Nicodemus. We have the famous saying on the pneuma, the wind or the spirit blows where it will. And you don't know where it's going, where it's coming, or whatever. And this is symbolic of whatever this transformative principle is that Jesus is talking about in being born anno then. This sounds like something coming out of the book of Proverbs or Kohelet or whatever, and I think there's a gesture here toward the sapiential tradition. Not something that we usually associate with Pharisees given the emphasis on their legal interests, but I think it may be part of what John is conjuring up with his image of this Pharisee. And as usual, there's probably a little bit of irony in conjuring up this little bit of wisdom. One of the things that has intrigued people about Jesus and Nicodemus in particular is his relationship to potential historical characters. And just as there may be reference to historical features of the life of first century Palestine in the stone jars and the mikvaot, or the purification pools in Jerusalem, so too some people suspect there may be an allusion to something historical in the character of Nicodemus. Part of the data to worry about this comes from our friend Josephus, who tells us in War 451 that there was a fellow named Gorion who was a son of Nicodemus. At least the Latin version tells us this. The Greek version names this fellow Nicomedes. And Gorion, in any case, the son, we'll say he's Nicodemus' son for the sake of argument. We'll say that the Latin has it right and that we don't have an interference here from Johannine tradition in the text of Josephus. That Gorion, son of Nicodemus, accepts the surrender of the Romans in 66. So he's a prominent leader of the rebellion against Rome. There are also a couple of other characters that seem to have some sort of relationship to this Gorion. There's a guy named Joseph, son of Gorion, who, according to War 563, was elected one of the leaders of the rebellion. And there's another Gorion, son of a Joseph, who appears in War 159 and 358. All of these people seem to be, in some ways, related to someone who appears earlier in the history of Second Temple Judaism, a guy who pops up in Antiquities 1437, Nicodemus, who was an envoy to from Aristobulus II to Pompey. And Pompeius Magnus, who took over the area in 63, as we all know. So is there some sort of Nicodemus clan or Nicodemus Gorion clan that's involved here? Well, the question is interesting because we also have a character. First of all, let me just say, if that's so, what might be conjured up? If there's something being conjured up by the allusion to some sort of sapiential material in John 2 in connection with Nicodemus, is the very fact that Nicodemus is part of this leading elite revolutionary clan conjure up something? Well, it's interesting to look at the way Ioudaioi, son of Joseph, is described in the Bellum Judaicum 358. Gorion, among others, this is Thackeray's translation, among others was eliminated. He was assassinated. A person of exalted rank and birth, and yet a Democrat and filled with liberal principles, if ever a Jew was. His outspokenness added to the privileges of his position was the main cause of his ruin. As I said, that's Thackeray's translation. The filled with liberal principles, we might want to retranslate. It's phronematos eleutheriou mestos. Maybe just you're with a real strong inclination for freedom. In any case, is there something like that being conjured up with the character of Nicodemus if he's part of this Nicodemus-Gorian clan? Was he similar? Okay, that's the data from Josephus, and it seems to be a kind of weak reed to build anything on, but then we have rabbinic data as well, and the intersection between the two builds a somewhat interesting case. We have a Nicodemus ben Gorion, who appears in several rabbinic passages. In Bavli Gittin 56 and 57, he's one of a trio of wealthy Jerusalemites on the eve of the revolution against Rome. And there's an interest in this passage in the etymology of the name. Nicodemus is obviously a Greek name. Etymology, of course. People play with etymologies in the first century in all sorts of ways, even if it might not be allowed here in worrying about the Pharisees. In any case, Nicodemus means conqueror of the people. And whoever's putting this passage in Bavli together isn't particularly interested in that connotation, which of course fits into what we were talking about earlier as the revolutionary dimensions of this character. No, here the name is derived from a Hebrew root, naked, or Aramaic root, naked, that has the sun shining on him. Curious. Well, that demands a tail, doesn't it? And of course, when you have a tail that's demanded, you get it. And so in Bavli Ta'anit 19 and 20, a tale is told about how the name Nicodemus, which means the sun shone on him, came to be. And the story is that this Nicodemus, a wealthy guy just before the revolution against Rome, went and borrowed some money at a time of severe drought, borrowed some money from a ruler, an Edon, probably a Roman official, so he could buy some water to help the people in Jerusalem. So he was a person of means and obviously someone who was involved in social justice issues. And he was supposed to pay this money back by the end of the day. And the day comes, it's a rainy day, nothing happens, he isn't able to pay, the rain comes, so there's water, and he's able to take care of all of the people. The guy comes and demands his money back and says, you're supposed to have paid by the end of the day. And so Nicodemus, obviously the pious guy, prays some more, and the sun comes out at the very end, just before dusk. And so he's able to pay the money back before the end of the day, and all is well. Okay, so there's that interesting story that explains the name that obviously was an embarrassment of some sort. And another little datum is given to us in this account. That is that Nicodemus had a nickname, Buni, which we also find in Bavli Avodah Zarah. Now, that's interesting because there's another text, Bavli Sanhedrin 43a, that tells us that Jesus had 5 disciples among the people who were in Jerusalem in his day. And the names were Mattai, Nakai, Neser, Buni, and Toda. So you put 2 and 2 together here and you get Buni, the nickname of Nicodemus ben Gorion, who was in touch with Roman elites, a wealthy guy, taking care of people, etc. And there he is. Connection with the Pharisees, according to Genesis Rabbah 42, he was a disciple of Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So you have people like Richard Bauckham who have put together a genealogy of the Ben-Gurion Nicodemus clan that looks roughly as follows. You have Nicodemus in Antiquities 1437 at the time of Pompey, and 2 or 3 generations later, I've just put 1 generation in there, but there are probably more. You have this Gurion, who has at least 3 sons. Nicodemus, who also had a Gurion son. Hezekiah. There are several other passages that talk about this family in the Talmud that I'm not able to give you right here. And also a Joseph, who had the son Gurion, whom we've already mentioned. Bauckham says, okay, we have this Nicodemus, father of Gurion, but that's not our Nicodemus. The Nicodemus that we're talking about in the 4th Gospel has to be a little earlier, so he's probably a brother of Gurion. Interesting way of putting the data together, somewhat speculative, but there it is, okay? Is this stuff that we need in order to make sense of this Pharisee in the 4th Gospel? Perhaps if we think that the Gospel of John is interested in putting together historical facts. But if we don't think that, it still might be interesting because it shows what might be conjured up by this story, if these stories go back as far as we would like them to. All of this stuff, of course, is late rabbinic, right? And so how much of it can be used to reconstruct anything in the 1st century? But it is interesting. In the 4th Gospel, we have this character, unnamed in any other New Testament text, who is prominent as a leader of the Jews and seems to conjure up certain things that the evangelist wants to conjure. Why? What are we going to say about what Nicodemus does? He's a Pharisee, leader of the Jews. He doesn't condemn Jesus, and he gives him a very proper burial. We can see him in art in various places. The guy with the big headdress on the left is probably to be construed as Nicodemus. We can see him in Vienna, where we have Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus. This seems to be a very prominent theme in the art of Venice. But he is, at the end of the day, an ambiguous character, right? What does it mean to have Nicodemus spend all of his money burying Jesus? Is it a testimony to his faith in Jesus? Has he become a follower of Jesus in the dark, perhaps, gradually getting some light? Or is he still deeply in the dark by engaging in this kind of burial? John Chrysostom gave us a reading of this text that follows the latter path. And here is what this church father says. For they, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, still regarded Christ as merely man. Thus they brought spices which are most likely to preserve the body for a long while and not permit it quickly to become the prey of corruption, a procedure which indicated that they thought nothing out of the ordinary of him, except that they were displaying very tender affection to him. That's Chrysostom's reading. A step toward faith, but nowhere near where one ought to be. And that, says Chrysostom, is where the Pharisees are. Bauckham takes a different line and says that what we have in the 4th Gospel is someone who actually became a Christian, became a believer in Jesus. And he mirrors, in some ways, Mary who anoints him in chapter 12 with a similar kind of set of motifs, anointing with fragrant myrrh that fills the house. And is this a statement about belief in the significance of the death and the cross of Christ as part of a belief in resurrection? Well, that I think is what chapter 12 is doing. Is that what Nicodemus is doing in chapter 19? And of course, Bauckham also wants to have a historical connection here, and this is what John is interested in. No, I think John is interested in giving us a character who fits a certain stereotype of a rich Pharisee in the 1st century. I think the question is open whether John is saying this Pharisee gets it, or no, he's stuck at a level where he'll never get it. And I leave that question open for you to think about. So, thank you.